All right, welcome to part two. So now we're up to the year 1711. We're going to talk about Carey's Rebellion. It's another one that took place in North Carolina. So this rebellion might be my favorite one. You'll see why in a minute. It kind of sounds like a movie plot, movie that I'd really want to watch anyway. So in North Carolina at the time, there was like this history of political struggle between the Quaker population and the Anglican population. You might recall that Quakers were a more pacifist, egalitarian group. So this guy Carey, who the rebellion's named after, Carey is named the governor, and initially he's aligning with the Church of England, which is the Anglican population. And many of the Quakers are against him. They had him ordered to leave office. So they had someone go to England and get permission to remove him. That person got permission and had paperwork saying that Carey would be removed. And when that person returned, Carey was gone. He had left, and he had someone filling in for him. And the guy who was filling in for him was a guy that the Quakers approved of. So they were like, whatever, we don't need to worry about this right now. While Carey was gone, he switched his allegiance and sort of allied himself more to the Quakers. He came back and ousted his replacement, the guy he left in charge. This guy's name was Glover. So he got rid of Glover and he resumed his governorship, had all of the people who were loyal to the Church of England, they left the area. He had them flee to Virginia. But in 1711, England had finally sent over the replacement for Carey. That, they had given permission to remove him. They were going to send someone over. So this guy came over, Edward Hyde, to take over as governor. And when Carey saw that Edward Hyde was anti-Quaker, so he was more aligned with the Anglican views, Carey refused to give up the governorship, and he kept himself in office. So Hyde sends in an armed force to seize Carey and remove him from office, but Carey fled to his very well-armed home and prevented his seizure, prevented himself from getting caught. Carey rallied his supporters. He declared himself the true governor of North Carolina. He somehow managed to acquire several armed sailing ships, so sailboats with essentially cannons on them. And he attacked Hyde's supporters' homes along the river. He attacked Hyde himself. But there was a mishap with one of the guns on the ship, which caused Carey's group to flee the area. Hyde eventually was able to seize these abandoned ships, and in the meantime, Carey received help from some folks back in England. Not official help, again, because he was supposed to be replaced. So his friends came over, helped him try to maintain his governorship. Eventually, the governor of Virginia, where all of those Anglicans had fled, marched in with the militia to help Hyde. And so that was eventually what broke things up. Carey's followers left after hearing the militia was coming, and Carey was sent back to England in chains. He was eventually freed, so he didn't get much of a punishment, but he was temporarily imprisoned. Again, super exciting. I'd love to see a movie with cannons on sailboats. All right, the following year in New York, this is another pretty exciting one. It takes place in 1712. This one, reading back, a lot of historians would say that this seemed inevitable. There was a large enslaved population in New York at the time, and there was a fairly large population of free black people as well. And so, New York in the cities, it's a big place. People can easily communicate with one another. And so historians today kind of say, oh, this was just destined to happen, this uprising here. So what happened is that 23 armed black men set fire to this building and then waited for white men to come put out the fire. And when these guys came in to put out the fire, the black men attacked them. And so at least 9 people died in that attack. And the militia came in. They gathered about 27 enslaved people for punishment. 6 of them committed suicide before punishment could be levied because it was quite clear that this is going to be a harsh, harsh punishment. The rest of them were executed. Most of them were burned alive. So set a fire, you get fired to death. Quite a harsh punishment. As a result, there were much harsher laws put in place to prevent Black people from conspiring together. So restricting movement, restricting gatherings, certainly taking away any right they had to handle a firearm. They also made it harder they made manumission laws stricter, so making it harder for slaveholders to free their enslaved workers. So really, really cracked down on their slave codes in New York. Again, 1712. Okay, so the following year, 1713, we have the Boston Bread Riot. There's actually a series of 3 riots in between 1711, 1710, 1713, that area, those 3 years. So what was happening in Boston was that food was really scarce, and we definitely read about this in the Zen chapter, or again, you will read about it. So grain is one of those foods that's really scarce. Boston is in New England, as you know, and so that's not an area where they're growing a ton of crops. It's not the right environment. So most foods from Boston are being shipped in from some of the southern areas. So again, Boston imports all their food, and these wealthy merchants, when food was getting scarce, they started hoarding some foods, especially grain, and they started setting the prices higher. So hoarding it, driving the prices up, and then people would have to pay those higher prices. And so there's a series of these 3 riots. So 1710, some of the population of Boston raided Belcher's grain ship. They knew he was hoarding grain, so they raided it. Most of the people involved there were arrested and then released. The following year, in 1711, there was a fire in Boston, and it left 110 families without their homes. So not only are they low on food, but now they don't have homes. So there's another riot. People go in and steal more food items. The last of the 3 here was in 1713. And again, they're raiding the same guy as in 1710, this man Belcher, who is still hoarding grain and other foods. So this group of people goes in, they raid his warehouse, take the grain. And this final riot was actually successful in that there wasn't a punishment, but there were laws enacted preventing merchants from exporting low supply foods, and it also regulated prices. So they weren't allowed to drive up the prices and then ship them out elsewhere and get, a high profit from them. They had to sell them locally in Boston. Okay, let's see. Let's go to the Stono Rebellion. So this is in South Carolina, which is the largest ever slave revolt in the 13 British colonies. So it's in 1739, and what happened here was, on a quote-unquote free day, so a day when it was kind of like a weekend of sorts, about 20 enslaved people gathered at the Stono River and then raided a warehouse where they acquired a bunch of tools and weapons and items they could use as weapons anyway. They moved along from house to house, plantation to plantation along the river, killing the owners. Sometimes they would remove the head of the slaveholder and place it on the front steps, like as a trophy or a warning. And they would burn buildings. Some of the enslaved populations in these areas joined them, but some of them helped the slaveholders. So just depended on how much risk someone wanted to take on there. They did end up with over 100 people marching. And as they were marching along, they were chanting liberty along the way. Their goal was to get to Florida, which was a Spanish area, get to Florida, be free, maybe live with Native American groups where they could, have their freedom and not be a part of what was going on up there anymore. They did last for over a week, but eventually the colonists caught up with them and the militia, and they were all killed, unfortunately. But this was pretty successful, and one thing, as I'm sure you're going to guess, happened is that retaliation, stricter laws being put in place, white people freaking out that there's going to be another rebellion. So this definitely scared the slaveholding South for a very long 1741, we've got another series of fires in New York. So this is in New York, and one of them was in New Jersey. So 4 fires were started in one day, and, you know, the rebellion of 1712 is still fresh in people's minds, the day that fire started, and so everyone freaks out. No one really knows who started these fires. There's no evidence, but there are rumors going around that it was started again by enslaved people. So the punishment, you know, they had to figure out who to punish for these fires. They conducted this brief investigation where they didn't have really any information, but they decided that as punishment, they would execute 30 black men, 2 white men, and 2 white women. There were some rumors about various people being involved, so they settled on these specific people. And in addition, 70 people of African descent were exiled. And within the next few months, people continued spreading rumors of who might have been involved. 17 more black people were hanged, and 13 more burned at the stake. So a lot of people were executed in punishment for these mysterious fires that started. And it just continued this fear of future rebellions as well. So New York is freaking out, not just the South. Also in that area, so we have the Tenant Riots, which Zinn talks about. These are in New Jersey and New York as well in the 1740s, 50s, 60s. And this is a struggle between the rich and the poor. There were people squatting because they didn't have property, they didn't have money, and they had nowhere to live. And even today, we know how population feels about, you know, homeless folks. We definitely have that going on in Modesto here. So in 1746 in New Jersey, different land proprietors tried to get rid of the squatters that were on their land. So they would call in the authorities. There was violence, there was arrests. People who were arrested would get out, they would go back in and free their friends. And the same thing was happening in New York. People just trying to get rid of squatters. A fun thing that happened in New York during this time was that at one of the periods when people tried to go in and break their friends out of jail, they end up imprisoning the sheriff while they're there. So this part is interesting because this is when you start seeing colonial powers and English powers have a different reaction to this. So the colonial powers are the wealthy men who are trying to remain in control or trying to take control of the colonies. The British officials, in order to try and get some of the population on their side, they side with the poor. So they're trying to divide the white men in New York and New Jersey. And so because of that, the poor then often sided with England in struggles against the wealthy white colonists. So we start seeing this fracturing of society going on when Britain decides to take sides against the rich colonists. Let's see. I think I'm going to pause there. We're going to have a part 3, but it'll be short. And in part 3, we're going to talk about 3 more rebellions, and then we'll be done. See you soon.